Something just happened that will change everything you thought you knew about money, power, and the future of the global economy. And I need you to pay very close attention right now, because what I'm about to reveal isn't being discussed on mainstream financial networks, it's not trending on social media, and most people will wake up one day wondering how the world transformed overnight without anyone explaining it to them. China just made a move so calculated, so strategic, that it's sending shockwaves through the foundations of American economic dominance. We're not talking about a trade dispute. We're not talking about tariffs or technology bans. We're talking about something far more fundamental. China is systematically dismantling its position as America's largest foreign creditor, and the implications of this decision will touch every aspect of your financial life, whether you realize it or not. Before we dive deep into what this means for you, I want to ask you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now and smash the like button so this critical information reaches more people. The algorithm doesn't care about truth, it cares about engagement. So your action right now determines whether millions of people get to see this or whether it gets buried. Thank you for that. Now let's continue. The numbers are staggering, and they tell a story that should terrify anyone paying attention. China's holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds have plummeted from over $1.3 trillion at their peak to less than $700 billion today. Let me put that in perspective for you. That's more than $600 billion that China has pulled out of the American financial system. $600 billion that once financed American government spending, American military operations, American corporate bailouts, now redirected elsewhere. But here's what makes this different from any other financial transaction you've ever witnessed. This isn't panic selling. This isn't a market crash forcing liquidation. This is methodical, deliberate, strategic divestment that's been happening quietly for years. While most analysts dismissed it as routine portfolio management, they were wrong, dead wrong. And now we're seeing the consequences of that miscalculation play out in real time. To understand why this matters so profoundly, you need to understand the machinery that's been running the global economy for the past 50 years. After President Nixon severed the link between the dollar and gold in 1971, the United States established what I call the greatest financial privilege in human history. The dollar became the world's reserve currency not because of economic fundamentals, not because of superior productivity, but because of geopolitical dominance backed by military power and institutional control. Here's how the system worked, and I need you to really grasp this because it's the foundation of everything. Every country in the world needed dollars to conduct international trade. Want to buy oil? You need dollars. Want to protect yourself during a financial crisis? You need dollars. Want to trade with other nations? You need dollars. This created artificial demand for the currency that allowed the United States to run massive trade deficits year after year without facing the consequences that would bankrupt any other nation. Think about it this way. If you or I spend more than we earn every single month, eventually our credit cards get maxed out, the bills come due, and we face a reckoning. But the United States has been spending more than it produces for over 4 decades straight. And instead of facing consequences, the rest of the world kept lending them money by buying treasury bonds. It's the most extraordinary free lunch in economic history, and China was the biggest enabler of this system, holding more than $1 trillion in American debt at the peak. So why would China do this? Why would they finance their main geopolitical competitor? The standard explanation you'll hear from conventional economists is that it was mutually beneficial. America got cheap financing, China got access to American markets, everyone wins. But that explanation is dangerously incomplete because it ignores the power dynamics underneath the surface. China didn't have much choice, at least not initially. When you're running massive trade surpluses with the United States and accumulating dollars, you have to do something with that currency. And for decades, the only market deep enough and liquid enough to absorb those dollar flows was the U.S. Treasury market. So China bought bonds not because they loved America, but because there was nowhere else to put the money that made sense at the time. But here's the critical vulnerability that Chinese strategists have understood for years. By holding so much wealth in dollar-denominated assets, China made itself completely exposed to American financial power. If Washington decided to freeze those assets, China could lose hundreds of billions overnight. If Washington printed massive amounts of new dollars, the real value of China's holdings would evaporate. China was trapped in what economists call the dollar trap, and they knew it. Then came February 2022, and everything changed. When Russian forces moved into Ukraine, the United States and its allies made a decision that will be studied in history books for centuries. They froze approximately $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves. Read that again slowly. The United States and its allies seized $300 billion that belonged to another country's central bank. Now, I'm not here to debate the geopolitics of that conflict. What I'm here to tell you is that this action fundamentally altered the calculation of every finance minister, every central bank governor, every treasury official in every country around the world. In one move, the United States demonstrated that dollar assets aren't really assets at all. If you're on the wrong side of American foreign policy, they're hostages waiting to be taken. Put yourself in the position of Chinese leadership for a moment. You're sitting on $700 billion in treasury bonds. You know that Washington has identified you as their primary strategic competitor. The Pentagon has publicly stated you're the pacing threat. American politicians from both parties compete to see who can be tougher on China. Military alliances are being built across Asia specifically to contain your influence. And you just watched the United States freeze $300 billion belonging to another country they consider an adversary. What would you do? The answer is obvious. You'd reduce your exposure, diversify your holdings, and build alternative systems that don't depend on American goodwill. And that's exactly what China has been doing. Not loudly, not dramatically, but systematically and ruthlessly. The data from the U.S. Treasury Department shows this trend with crystal clarity. China has been selling bonds consistently for years now, but the pace has accelerated dramatically in the past 18 months. We're not talking about minor adjustments. We're talking about one of the largest and most sustained divestments in the history of international finance. And China isn't alone. Japan has reduced its holdings. Saudi Arabia is diversifying. Central banks around the world are buying gold at rates not seen since the 1950s. Something fundamental is breaking in the architecture of global finance, and most people have no idea it's happening. Let me ask you something, and I really want you to think about this and leave me a comment with your answer. Do you believe the US dollar will still be the world's dominant reserve currency 10 years from now? Write yes or no in the comments and tell me why you think that. I'm genuinely curious what you think, because this might be the most important economic question of our generation. Now here's where it gets even more interesting, and this is the part that should genuinely concern anyone who cares about the future. China isn't just selling treasury bonds. They're building an entirely parallel financial infrastructure designed to function independently of the dollar system. And they've been doing it so quietly, so methodically, that most Western analysts completely missed it until it was too late to stop. Let me introduce you to CIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system. This is China's alternative to SWIFT, the messaging network that facilitates international banking transactions. For decades, SWIFT was the only game in town. And because it's dominated by Western institutions, it gave Washington enormous power to monitor and control international financial flows. But CIPS changes that equation entirely. In 2024, CIPS processed over 175 trillion yuan in transactions. That's approximately $24 trillion flowing through a system that didn't exist 10 years ago. And the growth rate is exponential. More countries are connecting to CIPS every month. More banks are using it for cross-border transactions. And every transaction that goes through CIPS instead of SWIFT is a transaction that Washington can't monitor, can't control, and can't sanction. But wait, there's more. And this is where it gets truly revolutionary. China has been developing the digital yuan, officially called the ECNY. And it's not just another cryptocurrency or digital payment system. It's a central bank digital currency backed by the full faith and credit of the Chinese state. And it's designed from the ground up to facilitate international trade without touching the dollar system at all. Right now, over 260 million people in China are using the digital yuan. That's roughly the entire population of Indonesia, one of the largest countries on Earth. The transaction volume exceeded $250 billion last year, and that number is growing fast. But here's what makes this truly dangerous for dollar dominance. China is actively working with over 25 countries to enable cross-border payments using the digital yuan. Imagine a Chinese company buying soybeans from Brazil. Traditionally, that transaction would go through multiple steps. Convert yuan to dollars, move dollars through the international banking system, convert dollars to reais, all while paying fees and facing potential sanctions at each step. But with the digital yuan, that transaction can happen instantly, directly, peer-to-peer, with no American intermediary, no American oversight, and no American control. This is what financial sovereignty looks like in the 21st century. And China is building it brick by brick, while America is distracted by political theater and culture wars. And before you think this doesn't affect you personally, let me connect the dots in a way that will make this painfully real. The United States federal government is currently running a deficit of approximately $2 trillion every single year. That means the government spends $2 trillion more than it collects in taxes annually. That money has to come from somewhere, and that somewhere is bond sales. The Treasury Department has to find buyers for approximately $2 trillion in new debt every year just to keep the government functioning. For decades, foreign buyers, especially China, absorbed huge portions of that debt. But now, those buyers are pulling back, and here's the terrifying part. If foreign demand decreases, but the government still needs to borrow $2 trillion, who buys the bonds? The answer is the Federal Reserve. And when the central bank buys government debt, there's a technical term for that process. It's called debt monetization, or more simply, money printing. We saw exactly this during the pandemic. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet exploded from under $4 trillion to over $9 trillion at the peak. That's more than $5 trillion created essentially out of thin air to buy government bonds and mortgage-backed securities. And what was the result? The highest inflation in 40 years. Food prices jumped 20 to 40%. Gas prices doubled in many areas. Housing costs skyrocketed. Real wages fell even as nominal wages increased. Now here's the part that should terrify you. That was when foreign buyers were still participating in the Treasury market. What happens when China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, and other major holders continue reducing their positions? What happens when the Federal Reserve has to monetize even more debt just to keep the government funded? The answer is more inflation. And inflation is a hidden tax that falls hardest on people who work for wages rather than owning assets. Let me give you a concrete example that you've probably experienced personally. In 2020, the median home price in the United States was approximately $320,000. By 2025, it had risen to over $420,000. That's a 30% increase in just 5 years. If you already owned a home, congratulations, you got wealthier on paper. But if you were trying to buy your first home, the American dream just became $100,000 more expensive. That's not a coincidence. That's not just market forces. That's the direct result of monetary policy decisions made necessary by the debt dynamics we're discussing. And it's going to get worse, much worse, if the trends we're seeing continue. Because here's the mathematical reality that no politician wants to acknowledge. The United States currently pays over $600 billion annually just in interest on the national debt. That's more than the entire defense budget of most countries. And that number is rising exponentially as interest rates increase and the debt load grows. 5 years ago, interest payments were $350 billion. 10 years ago, they were $220 billion. The trajectory is clear and it's unsustainable. At some point, probably sooner than most people expect, the United States will reach a fiscal inflection point where the options become deeply unpleasant. Either cut spending dramatically, which is politically impossible, or monetize more debt, which means more inflation and a weaker dollar. Now, I want to hear from you on something, and this is important. So take a moment and leave me a comment. Where are you watching this video from right now? What country? What city? I want to understand how global this audience is because these issues affect everyone, regardless of where you live. Drop your location in the comments right now. The defenders of the current system will tell you I'm being alarmist. They'll say the dollar is too big to fail, that there's no real alternative, that China would hurt itself by selling too many bonds. These arguments sound reasonable on the surface, but they crumble under scrutiny because they're based on assumptions that are no longer true. The claim that there's no alternative to the dollar was accurate 20 years ago. It's not accurate today. China has systematically built alternatives, the infrastructure, the payment systems, the trade agreements, and the digital currency platforms that make dollar independence not just possible, but increasingly practical. And they're not alone in this effort. Look at what's happening with BRICS, the bloc of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These countries now represent a larger share of global GDP than the G7 industrialized nations. They're discussing creating a common trade currency. They're building development banks that compete with Western institutions. They're signing bilateral agreements to trade in local currencies, bypassing the dollar entirely. Saudi Arabia, the cornerstone of the petrodollar system for 50 years, is now considering joining BRICS and has discussed selling oil in yuan. 10 years ago, that would have been unthinkable. The petrodollar system was the foundation of dollar dominance. Every country needed energy. Energy was sold exclusively in dollars. Therefore, every country needed dollars. But if major oil producers start accepting yuan, rupees, and reais, that forced demand for dollars evaporates. And it's not just BRICS. Countries are signing bilateral trade agreements in local currencies at an accelerating pace. Argentina and Brazil trade in their own currencies. India and Russia use rupees and rubles. China has currency swap agreements with dozens of nations. Each individual agreement might seem small, but collectively they represent a massive trend away from dollar dependence. The data on central bank reserves tells the same story. The dollar's share of global reserves has fallen from over 70% 2 decades ago to approximately 58% today. Meanwhile, gold purchases by central banks hit record levels for the 3rd consecutive year. Central banks bought over 1,000 tons of gold in 2025 alone. That's the fastest accumulation since the 1950s. This isn't random. This isn't coincidence. This is coordinated movement away from dollar assets toward hard assets that can't be frozen, can't be sanctioned, and can't be inflated away by central bank policy. And here's what's particularly striking. China isn't just buying gold, they're building gold infrastructure. The Shanghai Gold Exchange now trades larger volumes than London and New York combined. China is setting its own global gold prices denominated in yuan, not dollars. This means a country that wants to buy gold can now do so without ever touching the dollar system. That's another crack in the foundation of dollar dominance, another piece of the architecture that's crumbling in real time. And the pace of change is accelerating, not slowing down. So what are the realistic scenarios for how this plays out? Because understanding the trajectory is crucial for protecting yourself and your family from what's coming. I see 4 possible paths, and none of them are particularly comfortable for the United States or for anyone holding significant dollar-denominated assets. Scenario 1 is managed decline. The United States accepts a multipolar world where the dollar remains important, but is no longer dominant. This would require humility and pragmatic adjustment to new realities. Based on historical precedent and current political dynamics, this seems highly unlikely. Empires rarely accept diminished status gracefully. Scenario 2 is confrontation. The United States tries to force the world to continue using the dollar through pressure, more aggressive sanctions, possibly even military action to control strategic resources and trade routes. This is dangerous because it turns an economic transition into a geopolitical powder keg. And given the rhetoric we're hearing from Washington about containing China, this scenario feels increasingly plausible. Scenario 3 is crisis. The United States continues the current trajectory, accumulating more debt, printing more money, until eventually hitting a fiscal crisis that forces dramatic change. This is the hard landing scenario. A dollar crisis, potential debt default, severe austerity, or hyperinflation. Nobody wants this outcome, but it becomes more likely every year the underlying problems aren't addressed. Scenario 4 is fragmentation. The global system gradually splits into currency blocks. A dollar zone, a yuan zone, possibly a eurozone. Trade between blocks becomes more difficult. The world becomes more unstable and unpredictable. But there's no single dramatic collapse, just a long, grinding erosion of the old order and constant friction as the new order emerges. My assessment, based on current trends, is that we're heading toward some combination of scenarios 2 and 4. Increasing confrontation between the United States and China, combined with gradual fragmentation of the global financial system into competing spheres of influence. And that has profound implications for how you should think about money, assets, and economic security. What China has done by selling these treasury bonds isn't the end of the story. It's the opening chapter of a much longer transformation of global economic order. And every signal suggests this process is accelerating, not reversing. More countries are diversifying away from dollars. More trade is happening in alternative currencies. More infrastructure is being built that bypasses American financial control. History shows us that transitions in global reserve currencies are always accompanied by turmoil. When the British pound yielded to the dollar after World War II, the British Empire collapsed. When Spain lost its silver standard in the 16th century, it went from superpower to regional power within a generation. When the Dutch guilder was replaced, Amsterdam's golden age ended. We are living through a historical inflection point. The next 10 to 15 years will define the global order for the century ahead. And most people don't even realize it's happening because they're focused on the daily noise, the political scandals, the celebrity gossip, the manufactured controversies designed to keep you distracted while the foundation of economic power shifts beneath your feet. So what does this mean for you personally? It means the world you grew up in is disappearing. If the dollar weakens significantly, imports become vastly more expensive. Everything from electronics to clothing to automobiles will cost more. If the United States has to pay higher interest rates on its debt, there's less money available for education, infrastructure, and social programs. If we enter a fiscal crisis, we could see deep cuts to programs that millions of people depend on for survival. None of this is abstract economic theory. This affects your ability to pay rent, buy groceries, save for retirement, and plan for your children's future. If the dollar loses 20% of its purchasing power against other currencies, everything imported becomes 20% more expensive. Your salary doesn't change, but your cost of living explodes. And this isn't a hypothetical scenario. It's already happening gradually, year after year, as the trends we've discussed accelerate. And here's my final question for you, and I really want your honest opinion in the comments. What do you think ordinary people should do to protect themselves from these economic shifts? Should they buy gold, invest in foreign currencies, purchase hard assets, learn new skills? Tell me in the comments what your strategy is, because I think this conversation is crucial and I want to hear diverse perspectives. The most frustrating part of all this is that none of it was unpredictable. Economists outside the mainstream, people like me who don't have institutional pressures to sugarcoat reality, have been warning about these contradictions for decades. We were dismissed as doomsayers, as contrarians, as people who didn't understand how things really work. But now we're here, watching exactly what we predicted unfold in real time. What China has done by systematically divesting from U.S. Treasury bonds is send a clear signal to every capital in the world. The era of unquestioned dollar dominance is over. Alternatives exist. Financial sovereignty is possible, and countries no longer have to accept exposure to American financial power as the inevitable price of participating in the global economy. This is just the beginning of a much deeper transformation. The old order is crumbling, and a new world is emerging right before our eyes. The question isn't whether this will happen. The question is whether you'll be prepared when it does. Thank you for watching this video all the way to the end. Your commitment to understanding these issues is exactly what we need more of in this world. Please hit that like button, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and share this video with anyone you think needs to understand what's really happening in the global economy. Your engagement genuinely matters because it determines whether this message reaches thousands or millions. I'll see you in the next one. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and stay prepared.